Okay. Good evening, everyone.
We're live, right?
It's a pleasure to have you all. This is our fourth webinar for the Libyan.
Okay. Good evening, everyone.
I have
We're
some.
live, right?
Okay. Good evening, everyone. This is welcome to the series of webinars of the Libyan Expertise Forum for Peace and Development. This is our first webinar in English, and we're happy to be partnering on this webinar with the IFIT and the Libyan Women's Platform for Peace. We have today a distinguished panel with us, and also a distinguished moderator from representing our partner, IFIT. It's exciting indeed. This is an important and critical moment. We're having this webinar on the eve of the LPDF meeting, where the LPDF will be meeting tomorrow to decide on the constitutional rule by which we're going to head to our elections, parliamentary and presidential elections on the 24th of December 2021. Today's panelists have produced interesting and relevant studies to the debate that we're having at the moment on subnational governance and how to build peace in Libya through subnational governance. So they will go through their two published studies, one with the World Bank and Brookings. But before that, I want to stress that the Libyan Expertise Forum for Peace and Development, we have been working for almost 2.5 years on developing our vision, our bottom-up plan, and we've been as well as our outreach plan program, and we have been arguing for quite some time that the UN approach in Libya has not been addressing the pertinent issues, and by that we mean the subnational governance. So far, the process has been primarily focused on an elusive political solution and not addressing the grievances and the root causes of the conflict in Libya. We, on the other hand, tend to believe that a bottom-up approach for Libya is what Libya needs. And that's why we have been working through our programs to stress this bottom-up approach. I will leave it now to, first of all, our moderator for today's, Seth Kaplan, who is, as I said, a senior advisor at IFIT and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Later, he will introduce the two panelists, and maybe there will be two presentations of the panelists. But later on, we're the second half of the webinar, we're opening it as an open discussion so that Libyans themselves engage in the discussion and discuss all the issues related to subnational governance, to the constitutional, to the project of the Constitution 2017, to Constitution 1951. All these issues are on the table for tonight. So without further ado, I will turn it to Seth And for all of you, this is live on our social media, Libyan Women's Platform for Peace. And we welcome and especially our members from the Libyan Expertise Forum for Peace and Development. I see now Dr. Ahmed Jahani, Hisham Al-Windi are more welcomed to engage in this, and all the other participants as well. We welcome you all. But we will start. Seth, the floor is yours and you will take it from there. Thank you, everyone. Looking forward to interesting, lively discussions.
Thank you, Zara, and it's a great pleasure to have our two guests as well as our participants and our broader audience. I'm representing IFIT, and we're very happy to cooperate with the LEFPD and to see all the good work that the organization does. And we look forward to hearing, as Zara said, we're going to have presentations. I'll ask a few questions, then we'll open it up for everyone else to join in, and we have 2 hours. And why don't we, who's going to go first? Are you going first, Stefan? If Stefan's going first, why don't you just self-introduce yourself? You might want to just say briefly about the World Bank report and the article that you wrote for Brookings, the two of you with Alexander Mark. And then by all means, go into your presentation, and then we'll go to Simona, and then I will come back with questions. And again, thank you everyone for joining.
Well, thank you very much, Seth. Thank you very much, Zara, also for the invitation and the opportunity to share here together with Simona some of our insights into subnational governance and conflict. As Seth has mentioned, Simona and I know each other primarily through the World Bank, through a study that we worked on together many years ago, and it took many years to complete. So it's really long and thorough, and we can share a link to it through the chat, which Marina has just done. Thank you very much, Marina. And then on the back of that study, Simona and I wrote a couple of blog pieces on Yemen, on Libya, on subnational governance more generally. And one of those was published by the Brookings Institution, and we have a link to that as well. You're very welcome to look at both of those, as well as a lot of the other things that we have written over the past several years. Just one more sentence by way of self-introduction. I'm a professor of international security at the University of Birmingham in England, in the United Kingdom. I've worked on these issues for all my scholarly life, which now is about 25 years, I'm almost ashamed to say. But I've also worked more practically as an advisor in various peace negotiations, including in Iraq, on Kirkuk in particular, but also Syria, Yemen, and for those of you with an interest in European affairs, for almost 20 years, I've tried to bring some conflict settlement to a tiny European country called Moldova. The fact that I've been working on this for 20 years should tell you that everything that I'm saying, you should take with a huge pinch of salt. So there is no recommendation here per se on what you should be doing, but rather a broader reflection on what in my experience, may or may not work well when it comes to subnational governance. I will be sharing my screen now with you. So you'll see the slides to which I'm speaking, which I hope will also make it a little bit easier for our interpreter. So here we go. So Simona and I will both speak more generally about decentralization and the different issues and options for Libya. And I will start with some broader comparative perspectives, because Libya is really not an area where I can claim any particular country expertise. So let me then just start quite generally with the question. Sorry, that was one too fast. So the question, the first question is, what actually is this decentralization and why is it important? And here, just very briefly, decentralization can describe both the process and the result of devolving power from the center to lower levels of governance. So very often, sort of related concepts that you have here are about delegation and deconcentration of power, but also decentralization sometimes is discussed in the context of federations or federacy arrangements. Sometimes these are also referred to as autonomy arrangements. And what it generally is meant to do is to achieve effective and responsive governance. So decentralization is not necessarily something that is only related to conflict settlement. Obviously, it plays an important role in the process of many conflict settlement attempts. And this, I think, is particularly obvious when we consider that at the local level, subnational governance enables greater participation, representation, and delivery of services, whereas nationally arrangements for subnational governance are very often couched in terms of intergovernmental relations that facilitate an overall viable state. And from my perspective, it's really important to keep these two things always in perspective. So there is obviously the local level where it's all about participation, representation, and better service delivery. But we also need to bear in mind that all of that needs to happen within an existing state and needs to make sure that the state as a whole is functioning. So does it work in practice, and how does it actually work? Well, most of the scholarly literature, the academic literature, would agree that a level of decentralization generally contributes to peace, both as a sort of conflict prevention measure, but also in the aftermath of conflict. That said, however, implementing decentralization reforms, especially after conflict, is often quite a slow process. It needs serious local political commitment and very often cannot work without external financial and technical support. But it also requires a degree of openness and flexibility for future reform. So very often the first sort of set of subnational governance arrangements that are installed in the process of constitutional reform, especially after conflict, are not necessarily sort of for all eternity. Very often reforms are subsequently necessary. And obviously it doesn't always work, and it does not necessarily in itself and on its own offer a sustainable solution to conflict. So there are a number of cases where it's been problematic. Democratic Republic of the Congo, Mali, South Sudan, for example. But for each of those more problematic cases, you can also find more positive experiences. Kenya, for example, I think would stand out here, South Africa, to some extent, Tanzania. Again, the important point to bear in mind here is that decentralization on its own is unlikely to settle conflicts. And it is also not a solution for all the underlying issues that many conflicts are faced with. So therefore, as I said earlier, it's really important to consider subnational governance alongside this broader set of intergovernmental relations. And one of the key findings that I can also back up with quite a lot of research of my own is that one of the key elements to success of subnational governance reforms is fiscal decentralization. So that's why I'm going to say a couple more things about the fiscal implications of decentralization. So as I just mentioned, this is critical to the success of subnational governance structures, particularly for two reasons. The first one is that without the financial resources to deliver on the political mandate that subnational governance structures have, they will not be sustainable. So without the money to actually discharge all the functions that they have, it simply won't work. It will be a huge disappointment and probably exacerbate conflict rather than settle it. So therefore, it's really important to bear in mind that whatever subnational governance structures are put in place, it's important that they do not become dysfunctional because of a lack of proper fiscal decentralization, because that is likely then to exacerbate grievances, tensions, mistrust, and ultimately lead to renewed conflict. So fiscal decentralization then can take two forms, and these two do not, they are not mutually exclusive, but they can often be combined. So one would be expenditure assignment, where there is a predetermined amount of money that is allocated to subnational governance structures through the competences that are assigned to them. So let's imagine there is responsibility for school education, then part of the government grant would be a certain amount of money that each local authority would have to discharge its functions in terms of school education. Another way of organizing subnational governance from a fiscal perspective is so-called revenue assignment. And here we can distinguish three different ways in which local authorities can gain revenue. One is from so-called own sources. So subnational governance structures then would have the power to impose regional taxes on their own, or to introduce a degree of variation on national rates. So where, let's say, VAT, for example, at the national level is, for argument's sake, 15%. A particular subnational governance entity might then say, well, actually, we increase that by 2% to increase the revenue that we have available to deliver our services. Or they might lower the corporation tax that they charge in order to stimulate business, for example. Second element of revenue assignment would be central government block grants. And these normally are formula-based rather than annually negotiated. So, for example, you could imagine that the government block grant is determined based on the number of people that live in a particular subnational governance area. And the third potential way of gaining revenues would be for subnational governance structures to borrow from national or international commercial lenders, for example. So basically go to a bank and say, we want to take out a loan to finance a particular infrastructure development project or something like that. Now, there are three key principles that need to be borne in mind when it comes to fiscal decentralization. The first one is transparency. So it needs to be clear what is being paid for and who pays for it. The second principle is accountability. So subnational governance structures that have their own budget would be accountable to citizens, so the people who pay the taxes, but also to the central government, in particular when the central government is a grant giver to subnational governance structures. And then finally, and again, sort of this goes back to the idea that only if subnational governance structures are financially sustainable can they actually work. Therefore, what is generally recommended, including by the World Bank, for example, is a so-called medium-term expenditure framework that gives local governments reasonably long and secure planning horizons so that they can both ensure the financing of the services that they need to deliver, but also sort of keep up the infrastructure that underpins their service delivery. Now, very often people then say, well, doesn't fiscal decentralization actually exacerbate some particular problems like corruption, rentierism, and crony capitalism? Yes, there certainly are increased risks that come with this, because it simply creates more entry points at which sort of corruption or rentierism can manifest itself. But bear in mind sort of these key principles of transparency and accountability, for example. So local communities are also better able to hold local officials accountable for the way in which their tax dollars are being spent. And at the same time, I think it's also important to bear in mind that as more sort of power and money that goes with the power is devolved from the center, you also reduce the amount of money and the amount of resources that are actually available at the center, where they could also, excuse me, where they could also lead to all of those pathologies like corruption, rentierism, crony capitalism. And where it would be much more difficult for people in particular localities to then hold officials at the center or accountable. So a final point that Zara asked me to briefly dwell upon is how decentralization works out in presidential or parliamentary systems. And there is no sort of fixed and fast rule that would say it's better to have a presidential or a parliamentary system, or decentralization is more effective in one or the other. The key issue really is how power is distributed within the overall constitutional system of the state. And some of the key issues to bear in mind here as you sort of think this through for the Libyan case would be sort of the four kinds of questions that I've formulated here. So the first one is, how strong is the legislature as part of the different branches of government, and does it have an upper chamber within it, and what is the power, or what are the powers that the upper chamber has? Moreover, how is this upper chamber constituted? Is it through direct election? Is it through a delegation of officials from local governance structures? Is it a proportionate or a disproportionate system? So think here, for example, of the United States, where the Senate has 2 members for each of the federal states, regardless of their geographical or population size, as opposed to the German system, where basically the state legislatures delegate members into the upper chamber of the German parliament, where they have a certain number of votes in proportion to the population size of each of the states. The third question to bear in mind is how well are decentralization arrangements protected? Are there constitutional articles that firmly entrench a particular decentralization arrangement, or is it ordinary legislation? And if the latter, can this just be undone by a simple majority, by an absolute majority, by a qualified majority of, say, 60% or 2/3? But also, what dispute resolution mechanisms are actually built into the system to resolve potential conflicts between different layers of governance, say between the center and local governments, or if you have a three-layered system where you have governorates or federal states as well. And the final question that I think is really important is about how well women, minorities, and vulnerable groups are integrated and protected at different levels of governance. And I want to end here with one particular finding that a couple of colleagues and I have had in the context of a project that we have been doing for the United States Institute of Peace for the past 18 months. And one of the things that we have found here is that, in particular, the inclusion of women and the protection of women in peace agreements has a disproportionately positive effect in preventing the recurrence of civil war. So I think this is something that is really important to bear in mind. Also, if you think more generally and more broadly about the kind of constitutional system that you want to put in place for Libya as you march on along your fine roadmap. And on that note, just again, the link to the World Bank report here, my email address if anybody wants to follow up on a particular issue with me directly, website, Twitter account, and all of that. And on that note, thank you very much. And I give the screen back to Seth.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And I have, you've left me with quite a series of questions in my mind, but I'm holding them off because we're very much looking forward to hearing from our other speaker, Simona. And if possible, could you just introduce yourself briefly? And then we very much look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you so much again for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to the participants for joining us today. Just quickly about me, I just recently rejoined the World Bank, actually, this time working on Libya in specific. I'm also a doctoral researcher at the University of Cambridge, looking at the constitution making and political process in Libya. Previously, I worked on Libya for UNSMIL, the United Nations political mission in Libya, and for the International Crisis Group. And as Stefan mentioned, I'm also co-author of the report on subnational governance and conflict for the World Bank. So after listening to Stefan on his excellent presentation on more technical issues, I'm hoping to apply these lessons to the Libyan context. Noting that most participants here are Libyans and probably know all of this better anyway, but here we go. Let me share the presentation. Okay. So subnational governance is at the heart of the Libyan conflict. Not only the
Simona, I think you have a little bit of a cold, but try to, I have a few people who can't hear you so well.
Okay, I will try to speak up. So subnational governance issues are at the heart of the Libyan conflict. Not only the East-West divide, also which is home to most of Libya's, implicitly recognized in the ongoing political process and in adopted power sharing agreements. For example, the composition of the Presidency Council, which consists of 3 members, each representing one region, takes account of these regional divisions. Yet, these issues have never been fully addressed. Neither the 2011 Constitutional Declaration, the 2015 Libyan Political Dialogue Agreement, the 2017 Constitutional Draft, nor the ongoing political process within the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum are fully addressing these issues. One of the reasons on why this might be that these politically sensitive issues haven't been addressed yet is that it is challenging to reconcile the competing demands for subnational governance of the different constituencies. While the points I'm making now are obviously not a full representation of the nuances of the positions of the constituencies within the different regions, and aren't fully taking account of the fragmentation of positions internally, broadly, one can say that the West is asking for a unitary state and a centralized governance system. They fear the disintegration of the country along the 3 regional, 3 historic regions. Meanwhile, the East is advocating for federalism. They want greater political autonomy and control over resources. The South is advocating for greater local governance at the municipality level. Southern communities are asking or hoping for improved service delivery, but they also want greater autonomy over their cultural affairs. At the heart of this is really the management of oil wealth and political participation. While the largest share of the population lives in the West, in Tripolitania, 80% of oil production and most of the reserves are sitting in the eastern region, and also a significant share in the south. So the East is advocating for greater regional autonomy over resource management, while the West is advocating for consolidation of the resources at the center to then be redistributed further down. Federalism might offer, not federalism, subnational governance, decentralization might offer some potential options to incorporate these competing demands. For example, one option might be to build on the 2017 constitutional draft, but to use the current form, which is based on a strong presidential system and weak decentralization, to potentially consider adopting a semi-presidential system, but most importantly, to underpin the current framework based on governorates and municipalities with stronger guarantees. One, to clearly outline within the Constitution what are the competencies held by subnational governance units, but also to give constitutional guarantees for budget transfers, to manifest within the Constitution how much of the oil, often a percentage, of the oil revenue earned will be distributed to the different regions. Another option would be weak federacy arrangements. Within the unitary system, asymmetric arrangements could be adopted. For example, granting the East great autonomy in their political affairs and the South greater autonomy in cultural affairs. However, to address fears on regional disintegration, along the historical boundaries, the intermediary level could be along different boundaries. For example, one option would be the 3 electoral districts that were adopted during the parliamentary elections for the House of Representatives. They are above the municipality, but they are below the 3 regions. And while the 2017 constitutional proposal foresees governorates rather than the 3 regions, it doesn't clearly state where the boundaries are drawn and how many subnational governance units there are to be. These could be complemented with power sharing arrangements at the center, which take into account regional representation. These include regional representation in the legislature, such as proposed in the 2017 constitutional proposal, with an upper chamber and a second chamber that could, a lower chamber, one representing the regions with equal representatives and another proportional. Although in its current form, the East and the South, and to some extent, believes that their regions aren't represented enough. So one could consider to increase the number of proportional representatives of the East and the South in Parliament. And also, as to some extent, followed already through the Presidency Council, and regional representatives heading certain ministries, this could be realized through power sharing arrangements in executive authority. Some consideration warrants the 1951 Constitution. It has some strength. For example, for the time when it was adopted, its protection of individual rights has been considered as very progressive. But it also has serious weaknesses. Most of all, that it's based on a monarchy and centers control in the hands of the king. But also with regards to the federal system that it proposes for the Libyan state, it's a very strong federal system along the 3 historical regions. And some might argue that it could potentially deepen regional divides. However, there are some potential design features that could be adopted in a future constitution or a revision of the redrafting of the 2017 constitutional proposal. One, it could serve as a basis for weak federacy arrangements, as I mentioned before, with asymmetric arrangements for the different regions, but also the 2-chamber parliament that it introduced in 1951, which now to a certain extent, as I already mentioned, is reflected in the 2017 constitutional proposal. Another interesting article is Article 199, which ensures that the regions have to approve any change in the state structure relating to subnational governance. However, if the 1951 Constitution were to serve as a basis for a future constitution or constitutional discussions, significant revisions would be required. Most importantly, to take account of the changing context, but also of democratic aspirations to ensure democratic elections, speak to make sure that there are no monarchical arrangements in the constitution. However, most of all, at the current stage in the political process in Libya, all of these questions are political rather than technical. First and foremost, actors and political elites and military elites have to agree to put the issue on the agenda of political negotiations and to tackle it hands-on. And when there is an agreement, to actually commit to its implementation. Technical issues that we have discussed are of a secondary question. However, exploring different options that subnational governance can offer in accommodating competing demands between the many different constituencies might help to showcase that there is a way to reconcile these different demands and might inform politicians' willingness, not only politicians, also military elites' willingness to discuss and implement subnational governance. Also, local communities, as Sarah expanded on a bottom-up approach, have an important role in not only voicing their demand for change, but also in holding the military and political leaders accountable to implement such change. Because after all, political elites and military elites and their militias are embedded within local communities and depend on their support. So local communities have an important role to play in ensuring the implementation of subnational governance. I will end here and happy to discuss these issues further in the Q&A.
Thank you both of you. And I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first few questions, but I encourage everybody else to prepare your questions, and you can either raise your hand literally or through Zoom, or you can put your question in the chat, and you're welcome to speak in Arabic. We have an interpreter, and we also have Zara, so do not hesitate to give us your thoughts. So for me, a few questions. One, I personally worked on Alexander's team that did the Pathways for Peace report. And a prominent part of that report was the importance of decentralization to managing, reducing, preventing conflict or getting out of conflict. And I believe this report is to some extent building on the Pathways for Peace report. That report was a United Nations World Bank joint report. And yet in Libya, UNSMIL, the UN representative or the UN acting body in Libya, has very rarely emphasized the importance of decentralization in all of its work. I'm wondering if either of you might have some interpretation of this. Do the UNSMIL people read your work? Do the UNSMIL people understand that the UN has supported decentralization as one of the most important ways to end conflict and prevent conflict? Their joint authorship. What are your comments on why UNSMIL has not made this a higher priority over the last 9 or 10 years? I don't know if either of you want to say anything on that, and I don't mean to be so pointed with the question, but I think I buy your arguments. Personally, I've worked on decentralization for many years, but it's very hard to see the UN actually implement it. Is there some structural constraints in the UN mission? Or the SRSG system that leads them to focus on political negotiations and not what we might think of as more structural issues that might be essential for change to actually occur. I don't know if either of you want to say anything. Simona, I think you have experience with UN missions, I believe in Iraq. And I don't know if you have any comments from your experience there about why doesn't UNSMIL do more? And what actually might encourage UNSMIL to make this a much more important issue than they have so far?
So actually, I worked for UNSMIL as well for quite a few years. So I have to tread carefully here.
Sorry.
No worries. But also, just to add, not only did our book build on the Pathways for Peace report, it actually was a background paper as well. So the Pathways for Peace report built on our book as well. But to focus on your question in particular, I think there are a couple of aspects. One is that UNSML was actually formed as a special envoy's mission. What that means is that its very job was to just focus on peace negotiations. Only along the years did its budget increase, and with it, its mandate. That said, I think UNSML is, or let's not say UNSML, but its leaders, I think believe they are realizing these or addressing these regional dynamics by emphasizing central power sharing arrangements, such as the one realized in the President's Council. Already as the 2015 Libyan political agreement was very much focused on ensuring that the President's Council represents different leaders from the different regions, and also that the government of national accord includes ministers from different regions. That said, I think another issue for UNSML has been competing priorities, trying to bring peace on a national level, which was tried to achieve through peace negotiations, but also to tackle security sector reform and other issues. So I think, but on a positive note, the World Bank and the UN, and together with the EU, are actually commencing a joint collaboration on a path forward for recovery and peace building, which will also look at decentralization. So we are going in the right direction.
Okay, a follow-up question. So this is for either of you. I know in Stefan's presentation, you gave some good examples and some bad examples. I forget, I remember Kenya was a positive. I think there was 3 of each, if memory serves me right. What do you think distinguishes the success or failure? And if you're in a situation like Libya, you're in a situation of conflict, are there other entry points for change beyond this top-down political settlement approach, which is the UNSML approach? Is there a way for more a bottom-up approach or a sideways approach or something that brings social forces together? So this is sort of a dual question. What distinguishes success from failure? And are there different ways to achieve change in a country where the top-down approach might not have led in this direction? What are your thoughts?
Right. So now I could easily go on for another hour and a half.
Sorry about that. I know it's an encyclopedic question.
So I think I mean, what distinguishes success from failures? I think at the most basic level is that if there is political will, there is a way to sustainable peace. If that political will is absent, it won't work. No matter how skillfully you craft a constitution, no matter how skillfully you craft a decentralization arrangement, if there are significant spoilers inside or outside of the country, that is in almost all cases a key indicator for failure. On the other hand, if you then want to go down sort of in terms of generality to a slightly more hands-on level where you can actually do something as a sort of as a population, as different political forces, but also as mediators. I mean, in various sort of research projects, including work that I've done myself, it actually does help to have UN mediation. So I think whatever you might consider doing in Libya, I would not recommend doing something that is outside of the current UN mediated process. I think the issue would be to add sort of discussions on decentralization and how to do it in a way that if you think back to Simona's second slide about all the different regional priorities, about how this can be accommodated now within the roadmap process. And again, I'm not that much of an expert on Libya or the ongoing process there. You also don't necessarily have to address every last aspect of a future political settlement within sort of the first set of peace negotiations that are really meant to bring peace. But by the same token, you shouldn't just shy away from addressing difficult questions in order to get a settlement, because I think certainly the recent history of Libyan various negotiations since 2011 sort of is littered with the tombstones of past proposals that didn't work because I think they didn't really address decentralization, or whatever you want to call it, as one of the key conflict issues. And I think here, perhaps the third issue that I would mention in terms of what distinguishes successes from failures is that in the success cases, what you usually find is sort of an approach that focuses on the issues that need to be resolved rather than on the labels that you use in order to dress up a solution. So in my experience, it's not helpful to have a big debate over should we have a federation or a confederation or decentralization or federacy arrangements or a state union or whatever it is. What really needs to be done, and I think this is also where this bottom-up approach is really useful, is to just identify issues that currently don't work, where people have significant grievances, where there are differences of opinion, and then have a really open mind and think, okay, how can we address this particular issue? Try to sort of look at comparative experiences. So not, is this a federal country or is this a highly centralized unitary country, but actually which countries have had similar issues that they needed to resolve and how have they resolved those issues. And I think it's from sort of this approach that you then can actually learn in terms of how you might come up with a solution that sort of addresses these two problems. On the one hand, you want to have local people with a real say in sort of their future destiny, if you want. And at the same time, you want to have what is overall a viable state in which you can have, all these great things: peace, prosperity, democracy, rights for women, rights for minorities, and so on and so forth. So I think it's really attention to detail and a genuine commitment on all sides to really make the best out of what is a difficult situation.
I see a few hands up. Let me just ask one more question and I'm going to turn it over to participants. I thank you for that. That was very informative. It seems that you're advising some combination of existing process that can negotiate through the differences, but also somehow build up some sort of bottom-up momentum so there's a broader will. Maybe needs to be a top-down and a bottom-up will. In the different options that were listed, I believe this was in Simona's, but Stefan just touched upon it. Either or both of you are welcome to answer it. The question is, how does a country determine? I mean, you could answer it's all through negotiations, but how does a country determine the best form of decentralization? There was some listed, and I could add others. you could certainly have a monarchy that was democratic so you could have a monarchy. The United Kingdom is a monarchy, and that hasn't prevented it from having some level of decentralization and democracy. So you surely could have a monarchy, but you also could have decentralization around the 3 provinces. You could have decentralization around, I think, electoral districts was mentioned, or governance, or you could have, and I don't know how organic, how much these are simply best guesses from the center, or how much of them are based on some sort of organic understanding of what groups are likely to work together well and put their capacity together well. Because I think decentralization depends upon a certain critical mass of cohesion and capacity at the decentralized unit. So how do you suggest, beyond the simple answer of political negotiations, what is the best combination of elements that would make decentralization work for a place like Libya? Especially given that, and I think I allude to one of the comments in the chat, the elites are divided. The elites are also somewhat disconnected from the mass of the population. Local elites might have different opinions on the subject than the elites that are negotiating. Of the 75 elites that go and meet in the political dialogue, how much are they representative of local elites? All of this isn't quite clear to me, and they haven't been chosen in a democratic fashion by any means. So any suggestions about the form, and how do you determine the form beyond politics, which is a black box to me in this case? I'm open to either of you answering that question.
Well, let me maybe venture out here first as the non-expert on Libya, drawing on some of the comparative experiences that you have. I mean, the examples that you have mentioned, including the UK, I mean, they are not post-conflict situations. I mean, their arrangements have very often grown over sometimes centuries of gradual organic development. I mean, we didn't really have devolution in the UK until the late 1990s. Then it was very differential, and in Wales, for example, it was touch and go whether the people of Wales actually really wanted to have a devolved government. 25 years later, they are really happy with it. So I think part of the point to make here is that whatever you decide is not necessarily the final word on what arrangement you have. And very often it's, I don't really want to say trial and error, because that I think would not do justice to the people who actually come up with constitutional arrangements. But what is really important, and again, this is also borne out by a lot of comparative research, is that you need to build in to whatever you put in place now, future opportunities for reform, for revisiting an arrangement, for reconsidering, well, does it actually work, rather than saying, okay, that's it now, it will not change. And then gradually things get worse and worse because it doesn't work. And then you might end up with another violent conflict. So I think it's built in a degree of flexibility into whatever arrangement you make now. Now, the second part of your question, I sort of take it, is about, well, how do you actually ratify whatever the negotiated agreement at the top is? And I think there's there is a place, I think, for what in some contexts is called a national dialogue, where you sort of have all kinds of meetings and forums and sort of town hall meetings that feed into the negotiation process at the top. But at the end, I don't think there is a way around a high-level negotiating body that basically brings together all the key power brokers. They do not have to do that in complete isolation from the people that they are ostensibly representing. I think it's important to have different mechanisms through which you can have a degree of public participation in these negotiations. But some of it will also require a real sort of technical body. And I think there's a legal drafting committee or something like that that is associated with the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum. And I also think you need to have sort of a group of experts that can actually sort of translate broad ideas about participation, representation, democracy, human rights, and so on and so forth, can translate this into actually workable legal constitutional arrangements. So you feed in, you negotiate, you feed in some more. In the end, you have an outcome, which is, let's call it the constitutional draft or something like that. And that then, I think, needs to be ratified. And I think here you then have different options. So there's the obvious one that is a referendum, and that I think is certainly one viable option. Another viable option is that you simply have elections where then different parties can campaign on the basis of whatever the negotiated outcome is. But in the end, I think this is really something that needs to be determined within the country. So I mean, that's not, I can sort of list options for you, but even with the best knowledge of Libya, I would not feel that I can tell you, okay, this is really what you should be doing. I think that's a decision essentially that needs to be left to the people of Libya and their representatives.
Simona, you want to add something, and then I'll go to questions.
Just a few things. Building on what Stefan said, yes, indeed, I think the CDA did not have the opportunity or did not engage in national consultations, whether due to security reasons or whatever. But there was recently a huge process undertaken by the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue to hold a national dialogue in cities across Libya. And actually in these discussions, the outcome was that decentralization was really, or subnational governance was really key, a key demand among many Libyans. So these, not necessarily led by the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, but a similar format should be expanded and then inform either a redrafting of the 2017 constitutional draft or a constitutional making process undertaken in the future. But also, as I mentioned, I think local communities and youth have an important role really in holding their leaders accountable. Leaders are embedded in local communities. They depend on their support. Local communities can make their voices heard, or I guess should. But also, as Stefan already mentioned, a mechanism for amendments and redrafting is important because the context changes really quickly. And the 2017 constitutional draft actually had the opposite. It had a clause saying that it could not be amended within 5 years. And as Said Al-Ali noted, by the time the 2017 constitutional draft was approved by the CDA, insecurity was an issue. So people were longing for a strong presidential system, whereas now, also following Haftar's assault on Tripoli, people are more looking for a weakened presidency. So the point being that the context is changing quickly, so a mechanism to amend and not redraft, but make amendments more achievable would be important.
Okay, thank you. Why don't, I'm going to go to questions now. I see, I think it's Fatih Omar Turbi. Please go first. And I saw Ibrahim Grada had his hand up. I'm sorry I didn't get to you, but you can go next if you would like. Go ahead, Mr. Omar Turbi. You're on mute. You need to unmute yourself. Thank you. Arabic or English, either way.
English. I'm thinking I'm mute.
No, we can
You're
hear you.
fine now. You were fine. We just heard you. Click one more time.
One more time. No, one more time.
One more time. Yes, please go.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much, Zahra, for setting this up, and thank you, Seth, for moderating this program. This is very, very, very important. Thank you, Simone, and thank you, Stefan. I really listened very intently, and Libya is a very completely different animal when you compare it with many different nations around the world. We tend to skip one very important piece, that is, Libya had gone through 4 decades plus maybe 5 decades of lack of proper institutions on the ground that are not functioning at all. That probably plays a great part, that actually contributes a great deal to what is happening as far as corruption is concerned. I've been pushing, and I think I have been trying as hard as I can to advocate the construction and reconstruction from the ground up of all different institutions in Libya. So even if there are some laws or regulations that have existed over the years, people have lost there's no respect for implementing any of these pieces. UNSMEL, to stay within UNSMEL and hope that UNSMEL or the United Nations could actually contribute to institutional building or improving governance in Libya is not going to help, because the UNSMEL's performance in the past year or so, I should say, or maybe less, has been abysmal, to be honest with you, has not been very, very constructive. And if you allow me to say that when you have, my background is quality management systems, Six Sigma, I worked for major companies. I've done a lot of great work in that arena. So when you have one piece missing in a process that you're pursuing, everything else falls apart. Everything falls apart. It's a one go. If you have 5 pieces to a process, one piece is not correct, it falls apart. We were close to making something better happen when we made recommendations. I think Zahra is witness to that to have a system that brings about nominations of the most experts and the most qualified Libyans. And believe it or not, there is a great number of Libyans who are great technocrats, have excellent experiences, whether inside the country or outside the country, but that are not coming forward to help in the construction of the country because of the processes we pursue to attract them or bring them on board to do some of the work. So if you start with attracting those people, form a body of no more than 15 ministers or technocrats to take the country from where it was at during that 6 years, during the Sarraj's peace, and then move it on. If you didn't do that, then you're going to go, unfortunately, perhaps another cycle of the same that we've been experiencing. So if you have people that are most qualified that actually come in and bring in experts from around the world to begin the reconstruction of our institutions, then actually we're actually making a little bit of progress. During the selection of the government that's in place now, and I'm sure Zahra and many people were witness to this, there were so many fallacies in the selection of that government that we're not likely to have those institutions the way we aspire to see happen. To sum it up, Libya lacks some of the most basic pieces to have any institution function. When you bring on, let's say, the best of the best ministers of any ministry, he couldn't function simply because he's not creating or driving policies. He's becoming, rolling up his sleeves and trying to put out fires throughout the whole entire time. And then you have a dysfunctional ministry, and that becomes part of the dysfunction in governance. Choosing 26 ministries now and thinking that you might be able to accomplish anything. So Libya needs substantial help. Whether you have a constitution or don't have a constitution, really, I want to stop here. I don't have any questions, but I just kind of wanted to lay out some of these issues, some of these problems. We can't rely on UNSMEL to solve our problems. You have a legislative body that's going to emerge hopefully in 2022, but guess what? It may be the same or similar legislative body as we've had for the past several years, because there have not been any push or a jolt of workshops to teach people how to elect these members of the new legislative body. That's not happening. Civil society across Libya lacks funding, and many of these organizations that I wanted to be involved with, or at least see if there's any resemblance of any contribution to training of the new governance, they don't even have the bylaws or the form of organizations that Europeans would be able to financially support, or North American NGOs would be able to support. So I'm very concerned that we're going to go through the same cycle again. So I'm going to stop at that.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. I'm going to keep going around before we circle back. Mr. Grada, do you want to say something? You lowered your hand, but I'm sure you have comments to make since I do know you. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Seth and Zahra, and also Simona and Stephen. I have no questions, just a few comments, and I would rather to say them in Arabic so I can express myself better. May I?
Please,
Yes.
go ahead.
Yes, سأتكلم بالعربية. أنا في رأيي أن موضوع اللامركزية في هذا الوضع الراهن هو موضوع مبكر، لأن أسبقيات حالة متغيرة، حالة تتقلب، وعندنا نقطة 2 لا مركزية واقعية الآن، بمعنى في غرب ليبيا وجنوبها تحديدا توجد بلديات ومجالس محلية وفروع بلدية هي تمارس درجة كبيرة من الحكم الذاتي. النقطة الثالثة، نحن في حاجة لتجميع، لأن هناك خلل سائد لدى الكثير من الناس بين الحكومة المركزية واللامركزية. اللامركزية لا تعني تفتيت أو إضعاف سلطة الحكومة المركزية، ولكن في رأيي نحن في حاجة الآن لتجميع كل السلطات ضمن السردية والمحتوى الليبي، إعادة تجميعها ولو نظريا في السلطة في الحكومة المركزية، ثم إعادة نشرها من جديد بما يناسب الواقع. أشرت أن في غرب ليبيا وجنوب ليبيا هناك شبه مناطق حكم ذاتي، ولكن أيضا في شرق ليبيا الرأي الآن مقيد في التعبير عنه. كل ما يتم الحديث عنه في اللامركزية هي مسألة الميزانية وتقسيمها والمناصب وتقسيمها، ونعود لمركزية أخرى. مرينا بهذه اللامركزية في فترات، حتى في عهد القذافي أسست الشعبيات وأعطيت ميزانيات، ولكن عادت نفس التمركزات في أشخاص. عندنا نقطة أخرى الآن في الواقع الليبي الآن، مدينتين طرابلس وبنغازي ممكن فيهم أكثر من حوالي نصف سكان ليبيا في مدينتين، وإذا ضفنا لهم 5 أو 6 مدن أخرى سنبقى في 80% من سكان ليبيا في مدينتين. وهنا يجب أن نفكر في اللامركزية بالمفهوم، لأن عندنا هجرة، عندنا فراغ سكاني، فيجب أن نفكر فيه. النقطة الأخرى، اللامركزية ما نحتاج في إعداد الميزانية، عندما تعد الميزانية من تحت إلى فوق، من تحت إلى فوق. الميزانية تذهب من القرية إلى المدينة حاجتهم، وليس في أنها تبقى الفوق وبعدين توزع حسب النفوذ والقوة والسيطرة. نقطة أخيرة، نحتاج لنظرة لا مركزية مؤسسة على الواقع الاجتماعي الاقتصادي. قبل ما يحدث النفط هناك دوائر أو مقاطعات أو مناطق اقتصادية اجتماعية في ليبيا، مجموعة مدن، مجموعة قرى ترتبط. مثلا أنا أتحدث عن غرب ليبيا الذي أنا أعرفه وأيضا عبر التاريخ. مثلا نحن في جبل نفوسة، من غريان إلى غدامس كان عندنا ارتباط مع الساحل اللي هو من الزاوية وزوارة وصرمان. كان هناك تبادل اقتصادي، هم يأتون ليلين في موسم الصيف يحصدوا الزرع والتين، ونحن نذهب في موسم التمور. فكيف نفكر أن اللامركزية تبنى على أساس اجتماعي اقتصادي؟ شكرا لهذه الملاحظات، وإن شاء الله تكون واضحة. شكرا.
Thank you. Let me just keep collecting a few comments and then we'll circle back to the speakers. I don't know if I see Michelle. Do you want to say something, Zara? I was going to ask Michelle.
Maybe Michelle, you want to say something?
Michelle, do you want to say something? I don't see your hand up, but I believe you have some things to ask or to comment on, please. If you're there. If not, I'll keep going.
So there's the dash. We don't have a name here, a name tag.
There's somebody, so I see two more hands up. One person does not have a name attached to it. Do you want to identify yourself? Your hand has been up for some time. I'd like to call you, but I don't know who you are without your name up.
Do you think this is mine, Seth? Because I'm
yes,
not
it's yours, Jihani.
Yeah, I must be mine.
Please, by all means, Dr. Jahani, please go ahead. Sorry, you're the mysterious person. So we know sometimes you're mysterious. So please go ahead, Dr. Jahani.
Well, first
and then I see Mabruk and Haytham, okay?
So we'll go to Mabruk and then we'll go to Mr.
Dr. Jahani, please. Dr. Jahani.
Dr. Jahani, thank you.
Thank you, Seth.
Dr. Jahani is a member of the Libyan Expertise Forum for Peace and Development, so as Mr. Grada, who just spoken now. So that's why we're having the order as such. Please go ahead, Dr. Jahani.
Thank you, Zahra. Thanks, Seth. Thanks to the speakers and all of the participants. I must say that I would like to delve in, but there's so many things gushing in my head. However, I'd like to be succinct and helpful. I'm reminded at the outset of the Chinese curse that one is caught between tyranny, despotism, and chaos. This is the worst curse that anybody or nation can encounter. Now, why do I say this? Well, because in effect, Libya evolutionary process as to what we call a bottom-up has been arrested by the tyranny and despotism of the 42 years, albeit that there were a lot of experimentation with decentralization, mostly boxology, what I call boxes, moving boxes around. However, there have been some serious attempt at, which we've looked at, namely that for 7 years there were serious attempts at decentralizing decision-making relating to development as well as contracting, and a disastrous ensued by way of the fact of there are no financial controls and all of the issues that can be studied, and the World Bank is well familiar with this study and the period and the way it's studied It didn't really merit a lot of scrutiny, unfortunately, but the budget was basically encumbered with huge debt, which still is there. You know, there's 7 billion from that era of the late 90s. Also, the civil service or the government employees tripled in size from 400,000 to past the million figure, et cetera, et cetera. So there's something for Simona to look at. By the way, I mean, I'm impressed by all of that presentation. However, I didn't really look at this, and I'll be happy to perhaps at one time see that, you know, and engage further. So that's the tyranny aspect that arrested the evolutionary process, as it were, and instead started a top-down experimentation with doxology, but mainly it was really tyrannical and despotic, and essentially tried to bring something akin to a Westphalian nation state that has a place under the international law, and so the foreign policy and or the defense expenditures and all of that ended skewing the whole nature of the state. Now comes the uprising, and I was lucky to have been in Benghazi at the time. Really what happened is something miraculous, that the evolutionary process or the green shoots started to spring out, namely the local councils that basically demanded quite a bit of autonomy. And they were doing well, and we were coordinating with them. I ended up being one of the ministers as a stabilization and all of that, but that's not the important news for tonight. What the important news is that as the country drifted back to something akin between despotism, or at least a trial to bring it back, and the anarchy of now a lot of people coming from abroad, whether they are Libyan or otherwise, and they basically try to also bring all kinds of ideas that half-baked, and as such, what really happened is a group tried to bring back some kind of a Gaddafi-esque kind of political system, and that group basically took charge of this area of so-called local government. It's not local, it's not government. They came up with this so-called law number 59, which actually you could look at it and you see that somebody really didn't even benefit from all of those experimentation of the 42 years. Now, the 42 years were basically burying the 18 years that preceded that. So therefore, all of that is probably daunting for me as a comment for the time being. However, what it tells me, now why law number 59, by the way, before I forget, was flawed, is one, it really didn't deal with the whole issue of fiscal decentralization and how to deal with the balance sheet aspect to it and how to bring accountability, etc., etc. We wrote a lot of comments in that, and they are available for people to see. They were provided to the World Bank and others. And then we ended up now with another supposedly controlled environment experimentation on a bottom up. And of course, I'm not discussing our group because I am part of this group on the bottom up, but bottom up not to be confused with the fact that it ignores the whole history of what has happened in Libya, the evolutionary process. Going back to 1951 or even predating that for a while, the British administration in the mid-40s, as the gun fell silent and they began to organize, they saw fit that Libya basically would have two administrations, one in the east and one in the west, and they basically tried to make sure that they would reflect that kind of autonomy. They were dealing with Prince Idris at the time, and then as they began to draft a constitution, people don't realize that it is a Westminster type of constitution. I mean, I just heard Simona making comment on it in the sense of the monarchical aspect and all of that. That's fine. I mean, but it was never intended to be a constitution where the king is absolute. He's not. As a matter of fact, is well constrained in letter and in the spirit of it. And of course, many of the decrees of the king were found annulled by the Supreme Court, or annulled by the Supreme Court of the time. And of course, even the king himself saw fit at some point, and that was unconstitutional, to abolish the monarchy and replace it with a republican form of government, which he has no business saying that. It's none of his business to abolish the monarchy. However, that debate has been committed to books, etc. So the bottom-up evolutionary side of things in Libya hasn't been studied as it should be, because each time it gets arrested either by some form of tyranny and despotism that is imposed for some time, purposes that are of perhaps meaningful, such as the oil companies making sure that the king basically abolished federalism in 1963, simply because they were worried about the fiscal arrangement where they have to pay taxes to 3 provinces and the rent and all of what it takes on the contractual basis of it. So that's a tyranny that was basically the rentier of these guests who were at that time, we know that story. It has been committed to books as well. So here, you have something here which is akin to what has happened in places which it could be that a European experience may be relevant in the way sort of a Poland or any of these countries have gone through these kind, and to call it a fragile state is correct. It's fragile, it has fragility, but and post-conflict, yes. But it's also something that speaks to you very loudly, namely that it's a very vast country with even Cyrenaica alone is you can put 60 Lebanon in there inside Cyrenaica. So it's a huge land mass with almost like a natural decentralization, namely that, as Brahim, my colleague, mentioned, there is these cities, but at the same time, there's almost like a nice distance between them. If you go east to west, they're about 100 kilometers apart until you get into this middle void. And of course, forces that have been unleashed by the previous regime, namely migration towards Tripoli and towards Benghazi. So anyway, I don't want to go on and on and on, but what I'm saying is these things have to be captured in the sense of the organic, what is missing from this. Why is it that the devolution is in essence something that may not be what is hoped to be, because you may not dealing with devolutions here. You may have to deal with the issue of development. How do you decentralize programming, budgeting, all of that stuff that is in many ways related to building on stuff that exists there, instead of having to go with the instinct to always go for the centralized model for its own reasons, namely that you have a despot, or you have some kind of the oil companies wanting it, or you could go on and on and on. So what seems to be sometimes top-down, bottom-up kind of dichotomy, or as it were, but it's sometimes also the natural devolution or evolution. The natural evolution gets stunted. It gets stunted and I really hope that this should be carried forward, and I don't want to feel that I know more than anybody else in the room. No, that's not the issue. I was in Benghazi and I saw with my eyes that these local councils were screaming for to take over, not only in the east, but it extended. People were joining the transitional council to represent these local council. Yes, many times they were designated or nominated, they're not elected, but we tried some election. However, there was a tyranny imposed from the top and chaos that came. And I think this, we have to be very careful that this curse doesn't continue. I could go on and on and on. I am sorry for this long intervention.
Thank you, Dr. Jahani. We always appreciate your comments. I hope you're doing well. So I have two more hands. One went down, but I'm gonna go through everybody, and then we're gonna circle back to Stefan with Simona with plenty of time for their observations or comments based on what we're hearing. I believe the hand up right now, is it Mabouk? How do I pronounce your name? Do I say that correctly?
السلام عليكم. أنا المبروك الغضاوي من بني وليد، مستشار في المجلس البلدي بن وليد، عضو شبكة الوسطاء المحليين الليبيين. نعم، أنا كل ما سمعت نعم أن هناك قصور في التشريعات المعمول بها الآن بالنسبة للإدارة المحلية، ولكن ليس هذا هو السبب في تدني الإدارة المحلية. ومن هنا أنا بنسأل السادة، نوجه السؤال: ألا تعتقدون بأن الإدارة الدولية هي السبب في تدهور كل شيء في ليبيا بما فيها الإدارة المحلية، وذلك بتوفير السلاح ودعم الميليشيات ودعم الفاسدين في ليبيا، يعني نقصد الفساد المالي؟ هي هذه الأسباب. لولا التدخل الدولي أنا متأكد أن في مدة وجيزة يصل الليبيين إلى حلول بما فيها الإدارة المحلية والحوكمة المحلية والقرار الرشيد. وشكرا.
شكرا. I think there's Haytham.
Haytham. Mr. El-Key, please go ahead. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Seth and Mrs. Zahra. It's good to see old faces. Brahim, Dr. Ahmed, and the others. Seth and Simona, thank you for an insightful report. I've got a few comments on the areas that you've touched when you talked about the fiscal side of decentralization. And out of experience and out of the work that we've done over the past couple of years, we've realized that the fiscal issue is a major issue because it gives empowerment. It does empower. And the problem with Libyans right now, there is a big problem that we have in our hand, which is the trust problem. Libyans don't trust each other. Now we're in a situation where we have, Dr. Jahani mentioned that it was some sort of a failed state, and with a failed state in our hand, we need to consider this bottom-up approach to build trust and also start the institutional development of the Libyan state. Now, this takes me to the other part of my comment, which is how do we do that? How do we actually transform this whole idea of state building into an exercise that can happen from a bottom to up approach? Is by making sure that this idea of fiscal empowerment needs to occur at a local level. Why is that an importance? I think it's because then we'll start to identifying the functions and roles of each of these levels, whether at the central level, whether at a subnational or a local level. People start to kind of defend their turf in the sense of knowing what their capacity is on what they can do and what they cannot do. Now, the current system right now that we're having is that the central government does it all, and obviously doesn't do much of it. And that's where I think the idea of what Simona and Stefan have discussed is that we really need to look at subnational and local governance as a tool for empowering people and making sure that the state building exercise needs to start up and running from that level on. One additional thing is that we need to know also the absorptive capacity of both the central and the subnational or the local. And this is where the international community, the aid agencies, etc., will then realize where their areas of expertise can go into a certain area to build capacity. And it is at all levels, by the way. state failure, the state collapse post 2011 has really given some sort of a very clear view of how the systems and the institutions in Libya cannot function. First of all, it's because they don't know their roles. Obviously, that's number one. And their functions are not explicit in the sense that they tell, given the local governance idea, it's that we give you your function, but we still allocate the money for you. So this whole idea of grabbing on the pot of gold and saying that we're better in monitoring, we're better in knowing what your needs are, needs to stop in Libya. But there has to be, obviously, what Stefan and Simona mentioned is the idea of accountability. We need to make sure that when this fiscal rules start to play, that these institutions at the local level or at the central level need to be accountable for their voters. That's my take on this discussion, and thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more time. Any more comments? Michelle, do you want to say anything? We didn't. I thought you had something to say earlier. Or Lamia or Amal, who I know are also from the forum. Do you want to say anything? Otherwise, I'm going to turn it back to Stefan and Simona. I'll give everyone another moment to questions. Anything, Zara? Anybody else you want me to call on?
Lamia and Amal. Let's go to Lamia first.
Lamia, you want to say anything? We have a couple of minutes and then we're going to turn it over. Anything you want to say, Lamia, and then Amal?
59 is important as well. Lamia is a leading expert on Law 59 and she's a member of our group as well. So her insights are important for this discussion. Then we'll go to Amal. She's an expert on national reconciliation, which is important for the issue of trust and horizontal building. Yes, Lamia, please go ahead. Thank you.
I'm not, hello, I'm not sure that you can hear me.
We hear you fine, Lamia. Good to hear your voice again.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for organizing this. It has been really interesting to listen in. To actually what has been presented, I agree with most of what has been presented, or even I would go to further to say everything that has been suggested and presented in this talk is very in line with the ideas that are discussed for years, and almost I would say that there is a nationwide agreement on most of these issues, on the decentralizations, the need of decentralization, and so on. My question would be, I lost the thread of thought when I was trying to link what was discussed with what's happening nowadays. As you all know, the process on the ground with the with trying to reach to elections on the 24th of December or as soon as is taking over all the efforts and all the energy. And I would even go further to say we are spread really thin as Libyans on trying to achieve many goals in a very limited span of time. And I worry about that. I worry that trying to do it this way is really, we could have very unwanted surprises in the process, or it will just drop apart. However, it still didn't link these efforts to the decentralization idea and concept, and empowering local powers and local, I don't even want to go to local authority on this in a sense, but saying local groups and being real partners in the process. Is this the right thing to discuss today, or with the institutions in place and bringing them out of the dead, basically, and reinstating them to do their jobs, basically, talking about the parliament and the all the the institutions, the main institution in the country. To call on also local authorities and local groups to play their part would be another level of complication to the process. And I was wondering, is that the right thing to do today? And if it is, how? That's, I know it's not a question, a say, or a comment. It's just a wonder, I guess. So. That's my thought on the matter, and thank you very much, everyone, for this group.
Thank you, Lami. That's excellent. Am I going to go to Amal now?
No, just let me, before going to Amal, because I want to leave the question to Amal, because Lamia's point is basically asking the relevance of this discussion this evening, and the relevance is the divergence of the political process led by the UN and the those who are arguing to go to hold the referendum, when we know, all of us, the deficiencies of the constitution draft of 2017 when it comes to the main critical issue that Libya needs to handle, which is local subnational governance. So that's the problem. We have the UN leading a process that has never actually addressed the main issue at heart of the Libyan crisis. So that's why we're having this discussion, because some are even pushing for having a referendum on this draft, which will lead the country to further division, because it does not actually, and it further exacerbates the fragility of the country. So this is why we're having it at this moment. And to give the floor to Amal, Amal has been working on local reconciliation, which is something that is much needed, especially tying it with subnational governance. And this is earlier with the panelists, we were discussing what is meant, because one of the questions was on national charter or social covenants. And we, for us, in our heritage, Libyan heritage, we know quite well what is الميثاق الاجتماعي أو الميثاق الوطني, which is social charters. It's nation building process on the horizontal level. And this should precede a vertical state building process, which the UN and certain international organizations tend to focus on state building, and not even state building, ticking the box on a democratic toolkit, and not addressing the major issues that needs to be addressed. So Amal, who is also a member of our team, has been working on a national strategy for national reconciliation. And as we know, part of the roadmap, which is supposed to lead to the elections, is supposed to establish a commission on national reconciliation. And part of the issues that needs to be addressed in this national reconciliation process is the issue that we are discussing today, subnational governance. So please, where is Amal?
Thank you. So Amo, you have, I want to make sure we have 10 minutes for our two speakers to close us out. So you have about 2.5 minutes to talk, Amo, please. Thank you.
Amal, تفضلي.
Are you there, Amal?
Yes, she's here. Amal, can you
I just-
unmute
she's not-
yourself?
You need to unmute yourself.
Marina, can you unmute Amal?
I cannot force her. I can only ask her to unmute.
Yes, ask her so she knows.
She's fine. Go ahead, Amal, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm very sorry that I just missed the presentations of the two speakers. Thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you so much. Actually, the question of reconciliation, it's very, very important. And I agree with Zahra that one of the main points which we have to focus at the moment, and actually this is one actually even part of the elements of the roadmap, the reconciliation issue. I don't know, I think within 2 minutes, what shall I say? And specifically when Zahra mentioned that I was involved actually in strategy, of course, there are many works have been done and conducted in various groups and international organizations, and also at the local level, tackled numbers of issues of the national reconciliation, whether this is local reconciliation, which based on urf or customary laws, and also some other issues, which I think the draft national strategy, it was very interesting to highlight numbers of issues actually, which are maybe at some stage would prevent any kind of solidarity or even trust at the moment, which I think, and one of the main elements which we have to focus on the trust among people at the grassroots or at the local level, or at the local level, and then and I think the issue of reconciliation has many elements. One element has to do with of course with the institutions. And the other hand, I think there are some other issues has to do basically which people, there's a lot when we talk about the issue of missing persons. We talk about the legacy of Gaddafi regarding some laws like for instance, number 4, which has to do with property rights. And I think it's quite the issue of reconciliation is quite important, and I think this might need also a separate presentation, or maybe it would be part of the activities of the forum, probably for the upcoming weeks. But I would say that, of course, this is very important. And I think, as Zahra mentioned, I think what we need at the moment, the very basic thing for reconciliation at the moment, to identify the priorities of starting of the trust among people at all levels. The second thing, I think dialogue, which one of the speakers, the national dialogue, I think it's missing at the moment. And I think this is very important. And from there, I think it's important also even to have an institution, or at least re-established, or to reactivate one of the institutions which been developed at some stage, but unfortunately, this institution has been already not in function any longer, which is, I think, هيئة الحوار الوطني. Very important to recall back all these institutions. I would also recall the role of media. Of course, the media discourse, very important. Of course, education as well. I don't want to go further to that, but this is very important. And I don't want to forget the role of women at all levels. I think when we talk about the role of women, we could recall the role of many of our colleagues, Salwa and others who've been dealing with such issues, especially Salwa at some stage was the vice president of the National Dialogue Institute. And I think this is very, very important to now to talk and to tackle all these issues. And as I mentioned, this is a suggestion, maybe in the future we could talk further about such issues. And I think I should stop here just to give the speakers time to conclude and to comment on many of the issues.
I want to make sure they have time. Thank you, Amal. We have about 7 or 8 minutes left. Please go ahead, Stefan, and then we'll hear from Simona and we'll wrap up. I want to, and of course, for anyone who missed part of this, the whole recording is available afterwards. Go ahead, Stefan. Thank you for your patience. I wanted to be as inclusive as possible. Thank you. Any thoughts you have, we're very welcome to hear them.
Should I go ahead or?
You can go first if you want, Simona. Just keep it to 2 to 3 minutes so he has enough time. Thank you very much.
Sounds good. One I wanted to address, and I very much agree with most of the speakers of the importance of Libya's history. One aspect is, I think there was no real time or opportunity to experience different governance models long enough. The Libyan state as it is today has only been formed in 1951 with a federal system. But then in 1963, only a few years after, it was changed again. And then with the coup in 1969, it was changed again. And actually during the Gaddafi era, the number of subnational units was constantly changed. So there was no one fixed governance structure for a very long time that could ripen and the entities could build capacity. And since the revolution, as you know well, no clear agreement on a governance structure, subnational governance structure has developed. So not only is there no experience, but also Libyans, since the founding of the state, haven't had the opportunity, as we heard through the comments, really to engage in a consensus building exercise. There is no shared vision of what the nature of the state should be. And ultimately, constitutional legitimacy really derives from reflecting the will of the people and a shared vision of what the state has to be. So in relation to what's the importance in the ongoing process, in addition to, as Sam has said, potentially considering a reopening of the 2017 draft before putting to a referendum, it's also important to, the current discussion on the electoral law is also influenced by that in terms of how does the parliament look like? How is it representative of the regions or local governance? And they then, in turn, once elected, can chart a path for the adoption of a permanent constitution. The last issue I wanted to raise is fiscal questions on budget transfers. I think a big issue currently is that the budgets are so structured that a majority of the funds are really soaked up by subsidies and salaries. So there's not much left for either operational issues or even less for investment and development or reconstruction. So even if you would allocate more finance to the Ministry of Local Governance or distribute it down to the municipalities for service delivery, there's not really much allocated in the budget for anything other than salaries and subsidies, so they can't really operate even if they would have the capacity to do so. So I agree. I think looking at the fiscal dimensions of it all is quite important.
Thank you. And now to close us off, Stefan, go ahead, please.
Right. So I see that I have about 2.5 minutes.
It's okay. Do your best, and if you're over a minute or two, we're not going to just stop then. So don't worry, please.
Thank you. No, I first of all wanted to say it's been really informative for me sort of to hear local perspectives from Libya and where you see the main problems that you are facing. Let me assure you that sort of in my comparative experience, these are problems that a lot of other states in similar situations have had. So this is, of course, to some extent always something unique, but to other extents, I think you can also take comfort from the fact that similarly difficult situations have been resolved reasonably well by other countries. One thing that I want to pick up on specifically, because it was mentioned in various ways by several of the speakers, is the question, well, how do you pack all of that into the current process and still come up with something viable that can enable elections of the 24th of December. And I think here one of the issues that is important to consider is that in a lot of countries, a lot of which have come out of similar conflicts, others which have never experienced any strife of the kind that Libya has had certainly for the past 10 years. Local governance is very often only mentioned in a relatively short way in the constitution by saying that there will be a certain territorial structure of the state with certain levels of government, and then a specific law on local government will further regulate the details of that. And I think in a way, this is potentially an opportunity that you could use here, which would not require a complete reopening of the 2017 draft, which would probably create a whole lot of other issues that other people with different agendas would want to renegotiate. Rather, what you could try to achieve is, as part of whatever ratification process of a new arrangement that should underpin the elections in December, actually make this a broader package, which would actually include a proper law on local self-government, subnational government, decentralization, whatever you call it. And rather than focusing on a wholesale opening up of the 2017 constitutional draft, sort of focus your efforts on what I gather now from the discussion might be a better version of law number 59, which should be properly anchored and entrenched and protected by the new constitution. I don't know whether this is helpful, whether that makes any sense, but in sort of my experience, that is something that has often worked quite well in other contexts. On that note, I shall mute myself.
Zara, thank you. Zara, do you want to have any last comments? You started, so I think you're going to close, and I do want to thank our speakers and our participants for joining. Go ahead, Zara.
Well, I wanted to thank you all. Thank you, first of all, Seth, for an excellent moderation. Thank our panelists for their excellent insights. And again, our participants for their more than excellent insights. And yes, definitely it's difficult and critical times. I think Libyans deserve to have time to think over all these issues that we have just discussed. We cannot be rushed into a referendum. Libyans need the constitutional process to be inclusive enough to reflect their history, their grievances, and so definitely a flawed constitutional process does not meet the aspirations of Libya. None